2. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Amino podcast. Today we are joined again by my good friend Tom Farrow, and we're going to be talking about conditioning. Last time he was on, we went into what does it really take to be an elite level like sevens rugby player. And today we kind of touched on gym and we touched on speed and the kind of day in the life. But today I want to basically find out about conditioning and fitness because obviously it's multifaceted. There's speed, there's strength, but obviously you need to be able to apply those things over 80 minutes, whether you're a kind of 15s rugby player, obviously 2 lots of 7 minutes if you're a sevens player. So Tom, thank you for coming back on, and
thank you very much for having me again, mate.
Appreciate your knowledge and insights as always. Guys, just before we get into it, if you have any questions for Tom, make sure you leave them in the comment section below, and also hit the like and subscribe button for us, as we're still trying to build this channel. We really appreciate it. So yeah, Tom, so we were just chatting before we came on. Conditioning, do you want to put like what is fitness, what is conditioning from your eyes? Do you want to give us a bit of a kind of definition or kind of how you view it?
Okay, so I think firstly I just want to say that strength and conditioning as a term I'm not a fan of, to be honest, because I think there's some connotations with it that have led it astray in many ways. So strength and conditioning basically makes you think about weights and running. Okay. But conditioning in itself isn't a bad word, because conditioning is like what we're trying to do. We're trying to condition ourselves to do something. So that's how I think about conditioning in a sense. So with sevens, for example, we're trying to condition the players to be able to tolerate the game of sevens. Okay, so there's two ways I think we need to talk about conditioning. So there's that I talk about tolerating the loads they're going to be exposed to so they don't break down. And then there's repeatability. So you talked about speed and agility and power. Like that's what defines performance. How powerful you are, how fast you are in a moment, how quickly you solve the problem, how efficiently you solve the problem. What defines how well you do that at the end of the game is what I think of more as repeatability, because that gives us its proper importance in terms of trying to solve the problem. So what I think we get with conditioning is a lot of people saying they're doing conditioning, but they're just doing stuff that feels hard. And when you're competing at lower levels, and yeah, you can get away with doing whatever and you're going to improve, but the higher and higher levels you get to sport, the more purpose there has to be. I heard this from a great coach and friend of mine, Jonas, talked about the toothpaste tube analogy. When you're working with a beginner, you could, and you've got a new tube of toothpaste, you can press anywhere on it and toothpaste is going to come out. But as soon as you get towards the end of that, so if you've got a very experienced athlete operating at a high level, you could be very particular about how you squeeze and bend and fold the toothpaste tube to get some toothpaste out. So the same with conditioning and with elite athletes. But for me, it has to come back to purpose. You have to understand what is the purpose between what we're trying to do. Just making people tired is not good enough. And it happens a lot at every level of sport. And there needs to be much more purpose than that.
Interesting. That's really that's a really good point. So actually, when we just hear the term strength and conditioning or fitness, the first question that people really should be asking, rather than just going out and doing what you think. And I think a lot of people actually learn from what they've either done in the past or kind of what they've seen, isn't it? Like, oh, we're going to go and run stairs, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. And I guess actually that's a reasoning via analogy rather than going back to the first principles of what does the task require.
And the industry, and more specifically the culture, encourages this work, more is more, keep going. And that's not how biology is set up, and that's not how performance works. Performance has to have a purpose and a focus behind it in order to achieve a particular adaptation.
So we know that conditioning needs to be specific. That's obviously what we've just agreed on. So that's the first part of the equation. So with the rugby sevens, what is the specificity that you're kind of looking to put those guys through with their conditioning work? Is that the work frame?
Yeah, so then we're always with whoever we're working with, and this I think applies to performance in any realm, not just sport. What is the ultimate problem that needs to be solved? So within business, what makes you great at business? What makes you great in your particular role within business or in the corporate world, like world, finance world, whatever? The same principles apply. So when we're looking at sport, what is the ultimate problem to be solved? So for sevens over the last few years, it's been winning the Olympics. That's the ultimate problem to be solved. So we need to understand that there's going to be massive amounts of pressure. It's going to be a knockout format. There's probably not going to be as many games as there would be in a normal sevens tournament. There's going to be, everybody's going to be in the absolute best condition they could be. Everyone's going to bring their best selves to the Olympics. And it's going to be incredibly fast paced because there's not going to be as many games. So the final is probably going to be faster paced than a normal final, but obviously the pressure is going to be even more pressure than anything else. So we know what that looks like roughly. We have a rough idea of what we need to prepare them for. And then we work backwards from there. So then we're looking at, okay, what are the general forces, and we talk about usually in terms of load. What's the load that the athlete's going to be placed under physically as a physical performance specialist in that environment? And my role is to make sure that they're able to at first tolerate those loads and then excel within the later moments of those matches. And then I'm working backwards from that point. So then I'm looking at in terms of what directions do they move in, what speeds do they move at, and then the timings as well, and how long's a worst case scenario play. And so that's probably a second thing to really jump into. Is we've almost got the averages, and then we've got the worst case scenario. Worst case scenario, for example, in sevens, is you might get a play once or twice a season that lasts 2.5 minutes. Most plays are between 30 to 40 seconds, and then the rest is maybe 30 to 50 seconds. But again, that rest can be much shorter depending on how turnarounds take place. So we need them to be able to tolerate that worst case scenario. But if we spend our whole time training as if it's worst case scenario, then you take away from the speed and power of the average, because there's a trade-off. Yeah, there's a trade-off between speed, power, and endurance. Like, we can't be everything. And then you're going to get athletes in your team that are a bit more biased to one or the other. So the next level then is understand. So you've got to understand the sport, you've got to understand the game, and you've got to understand the athletes you're working with. What's their makeup? Are they muscularly dominant? Are they elastically dominant? Are they anaerobically dominant from an energetic perspective? Are they aerobically dominant from a energetic perspective? And understand what you can expect from them, because there's no point trying to turn a gazelle into like a lion in a way. You know, there's different ways of moving, there's different ways of managing forces as well. So before we start anything, I think there's a quote from Einstein that's something along the lines of, if you gave me an hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes figuring out exactly what the problem was. And I think that's the same way we need to approach conditioning and working with elite athletes, or anyone for that matter, is really understanding what the problem is before we run around making them tired, for example, which is what a lot of we see.
It's really interesting. I was just going to say, you just talked for probably 5 minutes and there wasn't a single mention of yo-yo or bleep test or any of these modalities. And this is a kind of really key point I want to get across, obviously, with this conversation today, is that you have to zoom out and you have to, like, really, exactly like Tom's saying, you have to ask better questions, zoom out and understand make sure you're solving the right problem before you start trying to solve it. I guess that's the real underlying point that Tom's making, is that you have to really understand. And obviously then within that, when you're talking about understanding, obviously that, so from what I've understood, what you said there is that obviously you've got what is the end goal, then we need to work backwards within that, then what are the averages, what are the key things that we need to be making people better at, and then what in terms of magnitude, what do we need to be making people better at, and then also then there's this another level, which is like, then I've got this group of individuals and I need to apply end goal, magnitude and average to this group of individual people who are all very different. And so it's kind of like this being aware of these stages. And obviously, I know it can obviously be making this sound slightly complex and slightly higher level, but it's about making sure that you're asking those right types of questions.
And then the next level is understanding your modalities, like you just said there, understanding your tools. Okay, so we've got the sport, we've got the athlete. Now, what tools have I got to affect the athlete in order to prepare them for that sport? And so things like tests, things like bleep test, yo-yo, you might use a 30-15 intermittent test, you might use Broncos, increasingly popular. Like, there's lots of ways to measure something. I'll get into that because that's an interesting one. There's lots of ways to measure anything, but whenever you're using a modality to test, you're testing the modality as much as you're testing the athlete and where they're at. Because, you know, there's like some tests have more research behind them, some tests have more history behind them than others. The yo-yo, for example, the bleep test, loads and loads of research clarifying it's or validating it next to something like a VO2 max test on a treadmill with gas exchange. Okay. But
I remember that with the bag at uni.
yeah, absolutely. So then, but you still have to understand is like with anything, just because something's been validated before, it's been used before, is it right for you right now with the people you're working with? That's always the question you have to ask. So there's a lot of discussion around Bronco test. The Bronco is essentially a 1200 meter shuttle test. It's meant to test aerobic ability. Okay. I can't remember exactly how many turns. There's something like 30, I'd worked it out before. There's maybe 36 or 38 turns or something like that within the Bronco test. There might be a 10 off that, but something, a significant amount of turns, let's say. So when you're doing the Bronco test and you're looking for you're looking to define aerobic ability. And the reason people use the Bronco test is because there's more turns and they say, therefore it's more like the game. But if they get a bad score on the Bronco test, is it because they're not very good aerobically? Is it because they're poor at turning? If they're poor at turning, is it because they don't have the physical capacity to turn? The muscles can't produce them and absorb force well enough? Or is it because technically they don't know where to put their body? So if you don't know how to turn, or if you're a complete imbecile, say, and you turn standing up every single time, and you're losing a second every single time, and then you get a bad Bronco score, is that an aerobic deficiency? Or is that a turning efficiency, which actually could be more of a mechanical or power issue than an aerobic issue? So then so that's why the test is so important. What's it telling us? And you want to have clarity on what the test is telling you. So if you can't have that clarity and then, oh, look, he's got a bad Bronco score, then you're going to have to go, oh, now we're going to do loads more aerobic training, when actually what the guy needed was change the direction coaching and speed power work. I'm going to have to use that pause button because I think my GPS units have just arrived.
No worries, no worries. We'll be back. Sorry about that. We're back. And so that was really insightful, actually. The Bronco test, I guess it's like, so you know where you kind of want to go. So you're kind of setting out this roadmap. You know where you want to go. You've got this group of individuals. Then we've talked about what modalities are you going to use. And then within the modalities, then you've also then have to be, there's an awareness that the school that you're seeing has multiple levers and pulleys. I guess within the one test, there's an analysis that needs to be done to make sure that the actual data that you're getting is valid as well. So, and you just mentioned about GPS. So, like, maybe do you want to dive into that a bit as well?
Yeah. So then, GPS is another way then of, I suppose, clarifying what's happening. And then we're going back to the loads. What loads are the athletes being exposed to? So then what we're going to do is pick a few metrics that, again, inform us about something that the athlete is experiencing. So there's most GPS units now give you somewhere between 30 to 80 different metrics you can look at.
Wow. And what do they do?
Do
the athlete put them on? Like, how do they wear them? Was it just a chip, or is it a...
So the unit, usually it's like a little square unit. I've got one somewhere, I don't think in this room, but little square unit. You usually see the little bumps on the backs, and then you see them wearing like the sports bras. That's what the GPS unit. So almost every GPS unit will be able to measure total distance covered, and then speeds at distance at different thresholds of speed. So what we'd look at would be total distance, high speed meters, which would usually be above 5 or 5.5 meters per second, sprint speed meters, which would be above 7 meters per second, accels and decels. So that's 3 meters, anything above 3 meters per second in the positive or negative.
Wow.
And then max speed. So there's like through those 5 metrics, I can get a good understanding of what the athlete's been exposed to, because each metric tells me something slightly different in terms of the forces that have been involved.
Wow.
And then it's a comparison over time. And what you're trying to do is make sure there's not, when you say, if I want the athletes to get up to here to this worst case scenario that's going to happen in the tournament, and at the start of the season or 2 years out, they're down here, I can't just jump up to here because they're all going to break very quickly. So then there needs to be some sort of push and pull as we stress and then rest and stress and then rest to get this adaptation up to this point. And then, so what I'll do is build them up to that tolerance or close to that tolerance as within earlier on in the pre-season, it's about them managing that load. Later part of pre-season and then later part of the season is about them excelling within that load. So then that's when we worry about how quickly can you recover within moment to moment. But at first I want to know that they can tolerate that load in a mechanical sense before I start worrying about the bioenergetics, the work-rest ratios as much and stuff like that.
Interesting. And that's a really great point, actually. And I think this is kind of where this is where we know you're talking to someone super high level, is that this idea of not just training for the sake of training, but like we talk about, like, I guess is your job, like your job is to help them. This is why we're talking about conditioning, is your job is to help people withstand the forces that are delivered within their event. And I think a lot of people, I think that's a really great, I think that's obviously kind of a long, really winded way of saying, get the body customized to what it's going to be doing, basically.
That's why, like, conditioning as a word is you're trying to condition the body to tolerate that. It's just been, I suppose, bastardized and used in a way that it's not really meant for, in a sense. And then just going, so there's two things I want to zoom out on, again, that role of the physical performance specialist in terms of managing forces. But before I do that, I just want to go back to GPS quickly and about clarifying your modalities. So whenever you're using, again, GPS is the same principle. You're testing the test, you're testing the numbers that are given to you, and you have to understand what those numbers represent. So they're getting, say if an athlete does 4,000 meters of total distance on a soft wet pitch, that's very different forces they've experienced compared to doing 4,000 meters on a hard pitch, or 4,000 meters on concrete, if they happen to do that, which would be a bad idea. But like that's, so you're always trying to ask beyond what is straight in front of your eyes. Like, what is this really? And I think that's why it's so important that we can't just go into stuff blindly. There always has to be that purpose, and then there always has to be that wider appreciation of what's actually happening.
And I guess data and science, sorry, just on that, I guess this is why it's a beauty. Obviously, it allows you to track change over time, but it's also nuanced in terms of the fact that you have to take each of the readings and each of the data points that you're taking in context to the situation, I guess, as well.
Yeah, exactly. Context is the word. That's the great word for it. And I think because what people want to do with data is hide behind it. It's an absolute. Oh, we've done this now. Look, data says this. We're done. And there's always another question. There's always another angle. And it's always just, okay, what now? What now? What does this mean? What does this mean? That's how, when you're in that environment, in my role, I'm always questioning and always trying to figure out what's the next problem to solve before it can be solved in a way.
And I guess that can get dangerous as well. Just on a point, not just on that, is like hubris. You get to a point where it's like, those are actually probably been the most dangerous types of mindsets to be in. That, oh, the data says this, so you're absolutely convinced. And then they haven't seen, like, I guess it's like your own personal bias and your own personal hubris that you haven't been aware enough that there is more.
And there's a lot of it in sport, because it comes down to fear ultimately, because in environments there's environments that are run on fear, and then everybody's trying to protect himself. So when everyone's trying to protect himself, they're not openly questioning what's real. They're just trying to make sure they've covered their backs. Oh, well, we've done this, we did what the data says, we kept within this framework. There's not an openness to be, well, what does this really mean, and what's changed, and something isn't happening the way I want it to happen. There's two ways you can approach that then, is openly to try and understand it, or in a closed manner where you try to explain it away. And I think we have to be really conscious to have and courageous to have the things to face it as something that there's new information there for us to learn.
Courage is
and then the other thing I wanted to zoom out on quickly is just on that idea of the physical performance coach. And I think it's really, really important, again, this balance between clarity and openness. So we have to understand clarity is what is our specific role. Our specific role is to help them tolerate and manage the forces that are exposed to them. And then, so almost prevent injury, simpler way of saying that. And then it's about them excelling within that environment. That's when, we're also, at the same time as managing injury, we're looking at making them faster, more powerful, stronger, and then fitter in a sense of able to recover quicker. We're also doing that. But we interact with another load of practitioners, and the problem itself is bigger than that. The problem in that involves a technical, tactical, and psychological realm. So it's really important that we can't then get lost in our world of, well, we need them to manage this. And there always has to be this back and forth interaction between all the other coaches, all the other medical practitioners, the physios, the massage therapists, the players themselves, the sports psychs, anyone that really can give us a further insight, and probably holding like the athlete themselves is the most important thing always. How they feeling, how are they feeling they're performing, and the more there can be an open conversation about that, the better it is for everyone as well.
100%. That's like a whole nother level. Yeah, definitely putting the athlete at the center, putting yourself at the center, and putting your health up there as well. I guess that's another point. I guess that like I guess you see this a lot depending on the types of athletes you're working with. But obviously, it's like you said, it's fear based, it's results driven. People want results, like, and especially even when money starts getting involved, I guess as well. And so, like, people will really, like, humans are capable of all sorts, aren't they? I guess if you really put a great goal at the end, like a large valuable goal at the end, people will push themselves into, like, run themselves into the ground. And I guess you're trying to help them guide.
That's the most important conversation you can have at the start of a season or at the start of a campaign or whatever, is that conversation between everyone. Like, what are we ultimately trying to achieve this year? Are we going to go out to make a point to win everything we possibly can? Are we at that level where we can do that now? Or are we actually going to focus on this thing at the end? And in order to get that big result, do we need to accept that some of the results on the way might not be wins, but they're learning opportunities? So, and you might say that in order to get that result at the end, we need to go out and try and win everyone in a way to it. Again, it's just a philosophical discussion, really. There's no one knows what's right and wrong until almost the result at the end proves the point. But I suppose the ongoing process has to be this conversation, communication, and reflection on what's happening.
Awesome. We framed it perfectly. Let's delve in. So we've talked about kind of the landscape. What does it require? Look at the end, work your way back, be aware, use data, but then be aware that there's nuance within the data. Let's delve in. Let's just use your sport that you're an expert in, rugby sevens. Rugby players that are listening to this, what are the best things that they could be doing to be getting fit for their, like, start with sevens, and then maybe give some advice for 15s players as well? Like, what are the metrics or tests that they should be using, and how would you use them?
Okay, I'm gonna hold you back from the finer details just a little bit more while we go a little bit more into the modalities. Okay, so now we start to pick apart the tools that we've got. So from a conditioning level, on a bioenergetic level, what are the energetic systems that the body's made up of? So you've got mechanical load and tolerating load as a separate type of thought process. So now we're talking about bioenergetics and how the body energetically how does the body produce energy in the different forms it can do. Okay, so you've got your three main energy systems. You've got your alactic, you've got your alactic anaerobic, you've got your lactic anaerobic or glycolytic, and then you've got your aerobic. 3 different ways of producing energy. All of them are trying to do the same thing, which is supply ATP, which is the energy producing molecule within the body. Okay, and they do it in different ways. The oxidative, the aerobic system can produce more ATP molecules per cycle, but it's a lot longer process to do that. The most explosive ATP in its almost raw form is there ready in the muscles, but there's only 1 or 2 seconds worth of that. Then you've got your alactic or creatine phosphate system, which can produce 1 or 2 molecules, but it can only do that for 6 seconds. So for every single energy system, there's a rate at which it can operate at, and then there's a capacity. So the rate is how much energy can it produce in that manner, how much energy can it produce alactically, and then there's a level for glycolytically, and then there's a level for aerobically, and there's another level below that that's aerobically with glycogen, there's aerobically without, so using fat. So there's a rate, and then there's a capacity. How long can it produce energy for in that through those energetic means? So that's when we start to then pick apart that problem as well. You can affect those systems, and once you understand the physiology and the bioenergetics underneath it, you've then got an insight how to affect that system. So short, incredibly powerful movements are going to stimulate the alactic system and challenge the alactic system to produce at a higher rate. Incredibly high effort, high output activities that might last, instead of like 5 or 6 seconds, 8, 9, 10 seconds, start to stimulate the alactic capacity. So how long can the body produce energy alactically? But there's quite tight genetic limitations on that for everyone. the most adaptable system is the aerobic system. That's the one that we can see the most change in. And at the level of burning fat, it can go for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. We know that you see everyone talks about marathon running. Everyone hits the wall at the 20-mile mark, roughly, because that's roughly our glycogen reserves. That's roughly how long they can last, basically. So you see a lot of now ultra endurance athletes and marathon runners and I suppose endurance athletes and the cyclists are big into this, is like almost following keto diets, and they're trying to optimize their body's ability to burn fat. So they're looking to improve their body's ability to burn fat at a higher level, but then they supplement with carbohydrates within races. So it becomes almost like a super fuel at the times they need it, rather than, because if they always have access to carbohydrates in their normal day-to-day life, the body doesn't learn how to oxidize fat at a higher rate. So this is where we understand the modality. Once you understand how they work physiologically, then you can understand how you want to challenge them. If you want to change, so then essentially the continuum in terms of power output goes from aerobic capacity work to alactic power work. And then there's different ways we can stimulate those systems. And then you add on the mechanical, I suppose, specificity principle to what movements do you need to stimulate those systems through. So with rugby or rugby sevens, there's obviously straight line and then multi-directional sprinting. We want the alactic system to be able to operate at an incredibly high rate. The aerobic system is really important because the aerobic system governs how quickly we can resynthesize our alactic reserves, basically. So the better our aerobic system is, the better we are at replenishing those alactic creatine resources to go again. So what we end up with is, if you look at sevens, so you've got alactic absolute max power there, which might be a maximal jump, say a long jump maybe, or even a high jump because it's a bit shorter, or shot put or something like that. Then you've got aerobic capacity, which would be an ultra long marathon or something like that. Sevens and a lot of team sports sit somewhere towards the mid between the middle and the top, somewhere there. And it's what they call alactic aerobic sport. It's incredibly explosive, and then there's periods of rest where you recover. Because it sits somewhere in the middle, you get a lot of people do a lot of conditioning somewhere in the middle, and they start the season doing that conditioning, and then it just carries on. But then if you start your season there, which is almost at the level you want to operate at, you've got nowhere to go or progress from there. So what my approach would be is to bring up the ceiling. Let's make them faster. Let's make them more powerful. Let's make them move better. And then also let's almost elongate the capacity at the floor. How well can they operate aerobically? We know we've got the most adaptation there. So we know we want to maximize those aerobic abilities because we can get more change in that than anything else. Then once we've got these two things as best as we can in the period that we choose to focus on it, then we start to work towards this point, which is the point we actually work on. So then in our conditioning, then we work towards repeat sprints, which in terms of your time periods of work rest look a lot more like the game. But early on, if we just did this at the start, where are we going to go to? We've got nowhere to progress to. And also early on in the season, you've got more time to purely focus on power. And the aerobic stuff, if you place it in the right point in the week, doesn't then interrupt with that. Whereas all this stuff in the middle interrupts with that alactic output.
I was going to say, this is the whole thing with polarizing the training, I guess, isn't it? That you're actually getting the benefit from you're building out your base. So obviously your pyramid can be like, the bigger the base of the pyramid, the higher the pyramid can go, type of thing. And I guess it's that idea that you're not just starting off with what you want, you're basically polarizing the training so that you're increasing the capacity of the base so that then you can build a taller pyramid. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I suppose the last point then goes back a little bit to the mechanical and what forces we're exposing ourselves to. So if we're talking directly to rugby players, your conditioning should primarily be taking place on your feet, because that's the problem you need to solve, is moving around on your feet. There's too much of being on a bike or doing all this other battle ropes and ski ergs and other stuff like that. For me, it's agitation. It's not training, it's agitation. And it's not contributing enough to fitness or real usable fitness, but what it is doing is taking away our energetic reserves to recover. Okay? The same energy we use to work is the same energy we need to recover. All adaptation takes place only when we're recovering. So if we're always draining the resources by, just agitation at the end of a session, oh, you can do a watt bike, oh, you can do this, you're not giving the system space to recover, and then they're perpetually tired. I think a lot of what we see in rugby certainly is tired teams that don't need to be tired. They can be fresher. And actually, instead of thinking, two teams come into a game, if one's fitter than the other but more tired, that fitness they've got is no use because they're coming from a lower starting point. So they won't look any fitter. So that's why it has to connect to the problem. What do we want them to do? We want them to look as fresh at the end of the game as possible. Part of that is bringing them into the game as fresh as possible. And there's this trade-off because we also need to train. We need to challenge, like we say, technical, tactical stuff. But let's have clarity on what we actually want to achieve because, and that's not to say I don't use watt bikes and ski ergs, but I use it when they can't run. If they absolutely can't run, we'll use it. A lot of the time, I don't think it carries off enough. And any player who's been for a long rehab, done all the watt bike in the world, all the other conditioning, who then tries to run for the first time and feels like a bag of shit, can testify for how little it actually transfers.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of one of the things that we're seeing in the kind of modern strength conditioning, even just as science has got better. Like there used to be this idea that this transfer of training and like you do one thing and it's kind of like this, I guess it's kind of just people doing stuff for the sake of doing it rather than it actually having a kind of desired effect. Like, and I've kind of remember someone saying like the best athletes are the ones who can polarize their training. They probably train harder than the average individual, but they also recover harder than the average individual. And it's about giving your body those two extremes to obviously for a chance to actually get the adaptation. So that's a really good point. And would you say, obviously, I guess this is probably a simple answer, but obviously to highlight it for people, when you're tired, it's not only about being tired, but obviously injury and like injuries, that's when the main point of injuries that happen, isn't it? I guess when when the body's fatigued and it can't withstand, you suddenly try and put large forces on a fatigued system. I guess that's where people get burnt out or they get tendon ruptures or whatever.
They put themselves in positions they wouldn't do otherwise. Certainly in rugby, if you're tired, you don't quite get to where you want to get to, and then you're reaching, you're getting a lot of shoulder injuries from that. So yeah, absolutely. And then it goes back again to that tolerance in terms of tolerating the load and how we organize our year. If we expose the body to loads at least a bit beyond what they're going to get exposed to, then when the body starts to feel those loads, it doesn't overreact to that and start becoming tired. So the way I organize it is more about, it might be semantics in a way, but it's stopping them from getting tired before thinking about how to make them cope with that tiredness. I feel like most approaches seem to focus on how we're going to cope with the tiredness first, almost like when the tiredness comes, how are we going to deal with it, instead of thinking we're going to stop them from experiencing that tiredness because they're able to tolerate that load. If you're used to running 5 miles a day, you're not going to feel particularly tired, especially if you give yourself a little bit of rest beforehand, if you then go out for a 5-mile run. If you never run 5 miles a day and then you go out for one, you're going to be hanging on maybe from 1 mile onwards. And then that's where your fitness really comes in, your ability to withstand fatigue and cope. So again, it's the reorganizing how we think about it and what the problems we're really trying to solve.
100%. So let's delve into maybe just, because I don't want to keep you for too much longer, let's delve into a little bit like the kind of practical stuff. So advice for practices, advice for tests, like what kind of things are you thinking off the top of your head?
So the test we'd use aerobically, which again isn't massively different to a bronco, would be we'd do 1,200 meter lengths of a pitch. And I think if we really wanted to look at aerobic ability, then we'll probably do it without the turns, because the same reason I said about the bronco, the reason we use the pitch and not a track is because they play on a pitch and we've got a pitch there, and it doesn't logistically means I haven't got to go find a track to book to get them to do a fitness test. I can just do their 12 lengths of a pitch and I get an idea of their of their aerobic ability, essentially.
And when you say 12 lengths of a pitch, you basically run 12 lengths of a pitch and that you as fast as you can.
Yeah, that's the test. So if people want, I suppose, something to aim for, to test it out for themselves, we're aiming for everybody to be below 4 minutes 30. There sometimes might be a few stragglers outside of there. We deem good, like pretty good, as below 4:15. But then we'd get a few people, the high aerobic achievers of the group, in the 3:50s. I think we've had a 3:54 might be our best.
And I guess what's that? So what's 3:54 is the PB? I guess what's that on average per length?
So it's just under 20 seconds a length.
Wow.
But here's context for you.
Have a go at that.
Here's context for you. The marathon world record, the average pace is 17 seconds per 100 meters.
Wow.
The average pace. And think about these boys. The Sevens boys are some of the fittest team sport players in the world. And they're after 100 lengths of a pitch at 3 minutes 55, at roughly 20 seconds average, just below, are dead. They're done. And that is including turns. So you could say, give them a little bit for that. But the average for the marathon world record, 17 seconds, just carry on going. And obviously that means some of them were even faster than that. So yeah, levels to the game, as we were talking about.
That's crazy. And so that's a good base for the aerobic. So that's a good place to start for the aerobic stuff. And then what other types of tests do you use? Obviously, I don't know if there's secrecy with some of these, but I guess
there's no secrecy. Again, it's just purpose. There has to be a purpose. There's no magical test. There's no magical thing. It's always what we're doing is interacting with the people we've got. So I could tell you a thing. I could tell you the whole program, and it wouldn't necessarily work for your situation and what you're doing. So a lot of the tests we do are around strength and power. So we do a whole force diagnostics in terms of single leg strength, power, reactivity, double leg strength, power, reactivity, and then maybe a little bit more focused around hips and hamstrings. So again, this goes back to tolerating load, not necessarily associated to fitness in the normal sense, but it is because it can give you an insight as to where they're likely to maybe break down. And if they break down, they're not fit. Like, that's the point. So that's why it's connected. If we don't tend to do this, but maybe at different times, depending on if we had a longer preparation period, maybe we'd look at a repeat sprint test. Can tell you quite a lot about the makeup of your athletes, because you're going to get the super explosive people who drop off very quickly, and you're going to get your aerobic beasts who don't get to the same top speed as the or low time as the explosive people, but they can go and go and go. So, and to be honest, I don't do it because I don't do it generally because I understand the athletes just from understanding them and watching them play. But if I had time, because I remember when you're doing tests and you're trying to do your testing battery at the start of a season, you're fitting it around rugby skills, you're fitting it around psych work, you're fitting around gym, you're fitting around all the other stuff. You're trying to get a stimulus as well as test. So you could test everything. There's loads you could test, but you have to almost have a practical cut-off point. But a repeat sprint test is an interesting test to do and useful. The other challenge of a repeat sprint test early in the season is it's very high stress, and therefore it's very high risk. So again, when we're testing a test, is this test appropriate for right now? In the same way, like ideally, if we're looking at numbers, getting maximal tests first thing in the season is the best way for me to look good as a coach, because when they're going to look at their worst is when they first show up. So it'd be great on a numbers basis to get them to do a maximal sprint, a maximal strength lift, and then all the other stuff. But there's some things you can do early on, other things you can't. Just need a week or so just to make sure you're happy with where they're at before you expose them to it. So with a repeat sprint test, for me, it's quite high risk, and for that reason, I wouldn't do it first thing in the season.
And and just give us like a rough idea of what's a repeat sprint test for you.
You could do a couple of different ways. You could do it straight line, so there's no turns. You might do 30, 40 meter sprints, or you could do it with turns. So then it'd be 15 meter there and back or something like that. And you might do it off a rolling 30-second clock, for example. And you'd get each sprint that they do. You'd then get, say if you did 2 sets of 6 or something like that, there's loads of different protocols you could organize it as. Again, you've just got to figure out what's it telling you and is it meaningful for you based on your situation. And then what you do is you'd get a time for each sprint or speed for each sprint. You could even display it as, and then that you're going to see some sort of drop off. And then obviously improvement would be an improvement in your, firstly your top sprint, but then every other sprint after. So again, what are you hoping to see, and understanding that, and then what does that tell you about the problem that needs to be solved at the end?
Interesting. Very good. Very interesting. Yeah, no, that's great. And do you see it just a final point on that? Like, do you see like, I've heard people talk about this kind of like speed reserve, and like the higher the peak, obviously the higher the data points on the drop off. Like, is that something that you see, like that type of phenomenon that you see, that obviously people probably could be working more on the top end to improve the peak, and then that then aids their drop off
Yeah,
data?
absolutely. So speed reserve would be a really nice way of displaying, I think, the makeup of the athlete. So you've got your maximal speed and then your maximal aerobic speed. So the 1200 test we do, the 12 lengths of the pitch, we take from that a maximal aerobic speed. And it's a guesstimate. It could be, it's not going to be accurate if you were to test it more accurately, probably on a treadmill or maybe without the turns. But we get a maximal aerobic speed from that. So we can then understand what makeup that athlete is. So you can look at their peak speed, their maximal aerobic speed, and it gives you an idea, okay, where you can bring things up. In most cases, I'd still organise the season is to try and push up that peak speed a little bit at the start of the season, just because I know how much easier it is to bring up that maximal aerobic speed because it's so much more adaptable. Those trying to really target that for me happens a little bit later in the season, because what I want to say, if you've got your peak speed and you've got your maximal aerobic speed, this is a percentage of that. Some people start the year as if they're trying to do this. So what I want to do is start the year and do this and then do that. So that, again, they're operating at a lower percentage of their maximal output. And that's sort of how I'd organise a year. There might be a few cases with a few athletes that I wouldn't do that with, but generally that's how I'd organise things.
And I guess that's a really good analogy, because obviously, like, you see this a lot of people, they're basically trying to work the fitness, but they never increase the actual. And I guess once this maximum increases, I guess it then allows you the capacity. I guess there is a bigger capacity, even if you haven't trained it yet, or you haven't trained that fitness parameter yet, then it gives you a much, if this, like you said, that if this is a percentage of the max number, I guess if you lift the max, then it gives you the capacity or the potential to then obviously lift this number higher, I guess, at a later date as well. So I think that's a really good point for people to recognize that it's not just about fitness, that you can also, you want to build that peak speed away from your event. Say if you're doing 7s or even 15s rugby, you build that peak speed because it gives you a greater potential and a greater allowance of greater speed reserve at a later date. So yeah, that's really good.
That'd be my main message if I'd want people to come away from this, is to that, like, have a purpose to your training. Like, and that might mean that you put sessions in the week that are for fun. Like, that's absolutely fine. Not everything has to be serious focused, but within your whole training, there needs to be purpose. There needs to be at least a level of understanding of what's going to be a real high stress for you and what's going to be a low stress for you. So you can organise your week so you don't burn out, you don't get injured, and you don't break down, which ultimately is no fun for anyone. But if you're an athlete of any variety, you absolutely need to be training with purpose. If you're an individual who just likes training for fitness or for fun, then there still needs to be some level of thought about what you're doing, so you don't break yourself, essentially. But if you're an athlete, if you're not training with purpose and you're doing stuff just to make yourself tired, for me, you might get lucky, but you're probably wasting your time.
100%. That's such a good message. And just for people, even if you aren't an elite athlete, exactly like Tom touched on there, you want to see improvement in yourself, in your life, and especially in your training. That's one of the things that makes your training addictive, and people want to see that they're getting better at stuff. I think it was Dan Pink's book Drive, he talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I think this is the idea of mastery, that you want to go to the gym, put effort in, and you want to see that you improve. And I think that's why a lot of people potentially may fall off, and when they burn themselves out, they do too much, they don't see the improvements. Whereas winning is addictive, and I think that's even for setting yourself up in the gym, it's this idea of maybe biting off a little bit less than you think you probably need to, but just doing it really well, like doing less better, and just really enjoying improving from session to session and not burning out. Tom,
I think that it's a little bit linked just to that idea of results again. Like for me, and what the whole idea behind Areté is life is about exploring your potential. Like I really believe that. But then in order to do that, we need to absolutely end ourselves in every moment. Like there can be a balance in exploring your potential, and you'll see on our Areté stuff the yin yang, and it's a big idea in terms of balance and how we get to where we want to get to.
Definitely. Tom, if people want to find out more about Areté, is it just what's the best? Is it the website or Instagram?
Yeah, the website is areté-performance.com. That gives a good overview of who we work with. Is pretty much anyone, to be honest, in any field, elite sport, youth sport, the corporate world, coach development, and what we call everyday athletes. So those individuals that might not be their full-time thing that they do in terms of sport, but they play sport on the weekend, or they've got a challenge. We've just worked with a guy who did. He was the first rugby prop to swim the channel. So we help prepare him for that. And so we love working with people with big goals, big dreams, and helping them get there. And then we're also on Instagram. If you search us, you'll find us, and Twitter and all the other stuff as well.
Tom, looking forward to getting you on again, mate. It was a super interesting chat. I always love
Pleasure, mate. Thanks for having me.
Take care, mate. Speak to you soon.